Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly wild story that sits right at the intersection of the Japanese economic bubble, strict government regulation, and one of the absolute most legendary sports cars ever built. We are going back to an era where money was just flowing. Automotive engineers were handed blank checks, and yet, somehow, a strange, totally artificial ceiling was suddenly slapped onto the entire industry.
So you might be wondering, why on earth did Japanese sports cars suddenly freeze at exactly 280 horsepower for a solid decade and a half? I mean, automotive performance and technology were absolutely exploding in the late 1980s. But then, almost overnight, the horsepower just hit a brick wall. So what exactly happened? Let's dive right into part one, the 280 horsepower mystery.
To really understand this horsepower freeze, we kind of have to look at a pretty grim social catalyst. 11,000. Back in 1989, Japanese traffic fatalities reached a tragic peak of 11,000 people. This grim era actually became known in Japan as the Second Traffic War. With the rapid influx of high-performance vehicles hitting the streets during the bubble economy, the government grew absolutely terrified. They thought cars were simply becoming way too fast and way too dangerous for public roads.
Now, what's fascinating is how the government actually handled this fear. The Ministry of Transport didn't just pass a sweeping law. Instead, they stepped in to enforce a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement among the domestic automakers. Basically, if an automaker tried to submit a car for type certification with anything more than 280 horsepower, the ministry wouldn't explicitly say it was illegal, but they'd miraculously find a reason to reject the paperwork until that horsepower was lowered. It was an implicit mandate to just stop the horsepower wars dead in their tracks.
Moving on to part two, birth of the Z32. The specific automotive culprit that truly terrified those regulators was born from Nissan's 901 movement. Now, what was that? Well, it was this incredibly ambitious internal initiative at Nissan to achieve world-leading automotive technology by the 1990s. Flush with bubble-era cash, Nissan engineers were essentially handed a blank check and told, go make the best cars on the planet. It was quite literally the perfect environment to birth a technological marvel. And out of that movement came an absolute masterpiece. The 1989 Nissan Fairlady Z32 was built with a truly visionary philosophy. They wanted to create a supercar that anyone could drive. Its design was revolutionary for the time. It featured this wide and low profile with a sharply sloped nose that made this front-engine rear-wheel drive car look more like a mid-engine exotic. It didn't just look fast either. It was designed from the ground up to go toe-to-toe with the very best sports cars Europe had to offer.
Which brings us to part three, the gentleman's agreement.
So Nissan's ground engineering plans were about to crash headfirst into government panic. They had originally intended to release not one, but three absolute titans in 1989. They had a 300-horsepower trio locked and loaded to dominate the market. The Fairlady Z32, the legendary Skyline GTR R32, and their flagship Infiniti Q45 luxury sedan. But right as they were seeking certification, the Ministry of Transport stepped in and essentially nerfed them. All three of these incredible machines were forced to be capped at 280 horsepower for the domestic market.
And if you want absolute proof of just how artificial this limit truly was, just look at the Japanese domestic market, or JDM Fairlady Z32. Capped at 280 horsepower, right? But the exact same car, sold over in the US market as the 300ZX, was totally unrestricted and shipped with its true 300 horsepower output. The engine was entirely capable of it. The Japanese government simply forced Nissan to slap a digital restrictor plate on it at home.
And here is the real kicker. This bizarre gentleman's agreement stayed in place for an unbelievable 15 years. Domestic automakers were forced to burn extra money, engineering completely separate domestic and export versions of their own cars, all while foreign imports from Europe and America were rolling into Japan selling 300 and 400 horsepower cars completely unrestricted. It's a textbook example of how arbitrary regulations can totally distort a market. It punished domestic innovators while giving competitors a massive free pass. The twisted irony here is that it didn't even end until 2004, finally broken by the 300 horsepower Honda Legend. And by that point, the Japanese market had largely shifted away from sports cars altogether.
Let's look closer at the tech in part four, engineering a supercar. To understand why this car is still considered a masterpiece, even with that restrictor plate, you have to look at its heart, the VG30 DETT. That's a 3.0-liter V6 twin-turbo engine.
And to keep all that power glued to the road, Nissan utilized a cutting-edge four-wheel multi-link suspension. The engineering here was just light years ahead of its time. They completely tossed out the old suspension setups used in previous Z cars to create a chassis that could genuinely handle supercar speeds. But they didn't stop there. To tame that immense power, Nissan introduced super high costs. Basically, this was an active electronic system that monitored the steering angle, steering speed, and vehicle speed to actively steer the rear wheels. I mean, that sounds like science fiction for 1989. It actively worked to transform the car from a raw muscle machine into a highly agile, incredibly stable handler that could corner with the absolute best of them. The ingenuity of the engine itself was next level too. The twin-turbo setup wasn't just slapped on as an afterthought. The engineers actually physically separated the intake and exhaust systems for each cylinder bank. So by giving each side of the V6 its own dedicated turbocharger, intercooler, and piping, they created a highly compact, linear, and just unbelievably responsive power delivery system.
And guess what? All of this incredible tech culminated in massive international acclaim. Without that 280 horsepower chokehold, the US market 300 horsepower Nissan 300ZX Turbo earned the highly prestigious Motor Trend 1990 Import Car of the Year award right out of the gate. It proved that Nissan's 901 movement had actually succeeded. They set out to build a world beater, and the automotive world was absolutely taking notice.
Finally, let's wrap up with Part 5, Legacy of the Z32. The Z32's life cycle was basically a roller coaster. It launches in '89, wins major awards in '90, and by 1992, they add this gorgeous convertible model with a manually operated top to keep the weight down. But then came a really steep drop-off later in the decade. By 1996, it's pulled from its largest market, the US. And by the year 2000, production quietly ends entirely in Japan. So what actually happened?
Ultimately, it wasn't a lack of brilliant engineering that killed the Z32.
It was just bad timing and shifting economics. Over in the US, insurance premiums for two-seater sports cars were skyrocketing, making them unbelievably expensive to own. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the market was experiencing a massive boom in RVs, minivans, and highly practical compact cars. The era of the high-priced, high-performance sports car was simply suffocated by changing consumer trends. But despite that quiet exit, its impact, definitely never forgotten. In August of 1996, they held a massive ceremony with hundreds of fans and executives, and the final U.S. market car, serial number 300, was donated directly to the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. In that moment, it instantly transitioned from a consumer vehicle into a deeply revered piece of automotive history. Which brings us to our final thought. How often does a single car's engineering push an entire nation to literally rewrite its rules? The Z32 was so incredibly advanced, so fast, and so ambitious that it terrified a government into creating a 15-year horsepower ban. It stands as a true testament to what happens when engineers are allowed to dream without limits, even if the law forces them to put a leash on it later. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.